discussing news and issues in orthopedics and spine healthcare. This is Spine Talk.
Hi, this is Dr. John Shim, and today I'm here with Jason Mazzo, orthopedic physician assistant, talking about a very academic topic, but one that's relevant to doctors and radiologists and people who deal with people with back pain. We're going to talk about the issue about the high intensity zone. So before Jason talks about high intensity zone, we just need to define it. Basically, MRI studies will show areas of inflammation to the various body parts. Radiologists have discovered that there's a small area of inflammation that can be seen at the end of a disc, and that area of inflammation is considered a high intensity zone. Well, the question is, what does that actually tell us? Jason?
So the study that we looked at comes to us from the Journal of Orthopedic Surgery and Research. The title of the study is Factors Associated with Lumbar Disc HIZ on T2 Weighted Magnetic Resonance Imaging, a retrospective study of 3,185 discs in 637 patients. Now this is a study that comes to us from China. It's a retrospective study where the researchers were looking at MRI images, chart reviews, and post-discography images for over 630 patients. The goal of the study was to clarify the correlation between age, gender, body weight, low back pain, and the presence of an HIZ sign. The results of the study, they found the highest incidence of HIZ lesions occurred in the 50 to 59 years old and those with the highest body weight. There was a significant difference in the prevalence rates of HIZ lesions in those that were asymptomatic versus those that were symptomatic. Overall in the study, the prevalence of HIZ was about 31.5%. The author's conclusion was that the presence of an HIZ lesion on a lumbar MRI was associated with aging, high body weight, and low back symptom. An HIZ sign indicated part of the natural history of disc degeneration, but was not an actual source of back pain. This goes kind of somewhat against conventional wisdom that all HIZ lesions cause back pain. So Dr. Shim, again, in kind of simple terms, can you kind of talk more about the an HIZ lesion and kind of what is the relevance of it?
Well, so, I was in my training in the early 90s. I did my fellowship in 1993. At that time, there was lots of excitement about the use of diagnostic studies, MRIs. And there was a study published by some pretty famous authors where they found these areas of intensity and inflammation on the back of the disc, and they described these things as high intensity zones. And at that time, the thought was these high intensity zones identified an acute problem and a source of back pain. So we're surgeons, we like to fix things, so we now had a finding, so we decided let's operate on these high intensity zones and see how people do. Well, unfortunately, the results weren't very good. And the more we explored about high intensity zones, we realized we may not understand it. Initially, the high intensity zones were considered acute findings. In other words, if you find a high intensity zone, it means something happened recently. Well, that turned out not to be true, because oftentimes if you find these high intensity zones, you'll see that same finding for years. So to say that that means something new happened just doesn't make sense. If you have that same finding and it's there for years, it doesn't make sense. There's been follow-up studies that looked at these high intensity zones and tried to identify the correlation of the high intensity zones with something called an annular tear, a tear of the disc. Well, follow-up studies using CT scans, discograms, and whatnot didn't always match a high intensity zone with the presence of an annular tear. So unfortunately, this is still a relatively controversial area. To me, it's kind of the we don't know what we don't know type of scenario again. The thought that it was the source of pain may be true, but we know many instances where these high intensity zones have nothing to do with somebody's pain. So to me, I don't go by the high intensity zones simply because I don't know the meaning of that high intensity zone.
Okay. The other question I have is, obviously we know that pain and pain perception across different cultural groups varies. This was again a Chinese study. So are there other potentially biological, maybe morphological, or even genetic differences across different cultures that can change or influence the outcome of a study like this?
Well, I mean, that's a very broad question, and between you and me, I bet there is something that's genetic and cultural, because the perception of pain is actually very individual, and it turns out to be also related to your family history, your family reaction to pain, cultural issues with pain, acceptability of pain in certain situations. There are many cultures where people have certain levels of discomfort to their back or their legs or whatnot, but they know there's nothing that can be done about it, so they just go forward and carry on. They may have these feelings of pain, but it doesn't affect them. There's other cultures where a little bit of pain is really significant and causes significant disabilities. So there are cultural issues involved when we're looking at different populations. To me, you know, I look at a lot of studies. You do see studies from different areas of the world. They will say in our population of 3,000 Finnish patients, 3,000 Chinese patients, 2,000 African patients, they do define their population because we're not 100% sure if what happens in the Finnish population is then also going to be correlated or found in the Chinese population. So to summarize, the high intensity zone is a finding on MRIs, but still at this time we do not 100% know what a high intensity zone means to patients. It may or may not be associated with pain. We hope we didn't confuse you more. This is Dr. Shem and Jason Mazza. Thank you for listening.